From covert operations to controversial policies, from hidden scandals to forbidden events, we're diving deep into the heart of American history to reveal what has been banned from your learning. In no particular order, because how could you rank these? We are diving into some of the darkest moments in America. Starting off today, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act. Passed in 1882, this was a significant piece of US legislation that basically put a ban on Chinese immigrants. It was the first time the US had ever banned a specific ethnic or national group from coming into the country, which is a pretty big deal in the history books. This law came about because of rising anti-Chinese sentiment, especially on the West Coast, where Chinese immigrants were often blamed for taking jobs and lowering wages. The act wasn't just a one-off thing, it lasted for more than 60 years and was only repealed in 1943. Its effects were harsh, families were split, and the Chinese American community faced a ton of discrimination and hardship. Even though it's a dark chapter, it's crucial to understand this act because it shows the challenges of immigration policies and the impact they have, lessons that are still relevant today. Next up, we have the Trail of Tears. When someone speaks about the Trail of Tears, they're referring to the forced relocation of indigenous American nations from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to areas west of the Mississippi River that had been designated as, quote, Indian Territory. Occurring in the 1830s, this brutal journey impacted several tribes, most notably the Cherokee, along with the Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. The US government, eager to expand territory for settlers, passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which authorized these forced relocations. The tribes were coerced into signing treaties that ceded their lands in exchange for territory out west. When the time came to move, thousands of indigenous Americans faced grueling conditions. Traveling over land and by boat, they endured harsh weather, disease, and insufficient supplies. It's estimated that around 4,000 Cherokee people alone died from hunger, exposure, and illness on the journey. This event wasn't just a one-off tragedy, it symbolized a broader policy of displacement and cultural eradication against indigenous Americans, which had lasting impacts on their communities. The Trail of Tears is a very poignant chapter in US history, reflecting the consequences of governmental policies driven by greed and disregard for indigenous people's rights and lives. It's a very stark reminder of the resilience of these communities and the injustices they've faced. Next up on our list, we have the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898. The Wilmington Insurrection was a significant and very violent event in American history that is often overlooked. It took place in Wilmington, North Carolina, and was essentially a racially motivated coup d'etat. At the time, Wilmington was a progressive city with a large black population and mixed-race government. However, a group of white supremacists, unhappy with this power sharing, plotted and executed a violent overthrow of the local government. They burned down the only black-owned newspaper, killed many black residents, and forced others, along with white allies, to leave the city. This coup led to the installation of white supremacist leaders and marked the beginning of a new era of Jim Crow laws and racial segregation in the South. It is a reminder of the lengths to which hate and racism can drive people, as well as the impact of such events on the course of history and racial relations in the United States. Next up, we have the Wounded Knee event. This devastating event at Wounded Knee happened on December 29, 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. It was a tragic and significant event where US Army soldiers took the lives of around 250 Lakota Sioux. This event was one of the final major clashes between indigenous Americans and settlers or military forces in the American American West, effectively marking the end of the Indian Wars. The tension was high because the US government was trying to suppress the ghost dance movement, a spiritual practice that the Lakota believed would bring about the renewal of the earth and the disappearance of the white people. The US Army saw this as rebellion and attempted to disarm the Lakota camp. A firearm accidentally went off and the soldiers reacted by opening fire. This site is now a National Historic Landmark, serving as a very somber reminder of this dark chapter in American history. Next up on our list today, we have eugenics and forced sterilization. Eugenics is a very controversial movement that aimed to improve the human gene pool by promoting the reproduction of people with desired traits and reducing that of those deemed inferior. This idea gained traction in various countries, including the United States and Germany, especially in the early 20th century. One of the darkest aspects of eugenics was forced sterilization, where individuals, often those with disabilities or belonging to marginalized communities, were sterilized without their consent. This practice was justified under the guise of public health and social improvement, but was in reality a gross violation of human rights. The legacy of eugenics and forced sterilization is a reminder of the dangers of misapplying science and violating individual autonomy. Over time, these practices have been widely condemned, highlighting a very dark chapter in the intersection of science, policy, and ethics. Next up today, we have the Zoot Suit Riots. The Zoot Suit Riots were a series of violent clashes during the early 1940s in Los Angeles, where American servicemen and local youth, particularly Mexican American youths who wore extravagant Zoot suits, faced off. The Zoot suit, with its long jacket and baggy trousers, was a very bold fashion statement that became synonymous with rebellion among minority youths. Tensions boiled over in June 1943 when groups of servicemen, fueled by racial prejudices and media hype, attacked Zoot suit wearers, alleging unpatriotic behavior. The riots escalated, with police often arresting the Zoot suiters. These events highlighted the deep-seated racial and cultural tensions in the US during World War II and have since been recognized as a very significant moment in the struggle for civil rights and cultural identity. Moving on down, we have McCarthyism and the Red Scare. McCarthyism and the Red Scare refer to a period in US history, primarily in the late 1940s and 1950s, marked by intense fear of communism and its potential spread in America. This paranoia was fueled by the Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Senator Joseph McCarthy became synonymous with this era due to his aggressive accusations and investigations into alleged communist activities in the US, especially within the government and entertainment industry. Though he initially gained significant support and notoriety, McCarthy's tactics, characterized by a lack of evidence and disregard for fairness, eventually led to his downfall. The term McCarthyism now broadly refers to any campaign or action that involves making unfair allegations or using questionable methods to suppress dissent or political opposition. The Red Scare and McCarthyism had lasting impacts on American society, instilling a climate of suspicion and infringing on civil liberties, and they serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hysteria and intolerance. Next up today, we have COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. This was a series of covert and often illegal activities conducted by the FBI aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting domestic political organizations. Active between 1956 and 1971, this program was primarily directed against the civil rights movement, feminist groups, communist parties, and activist groups opposed to the Vietnam War, among others. Notorious for its ethical and legal violations, COINTELPRO came to light in the early 70s when a group of activists broke into an FBI office and leaked documents exposing the program. Could you imagine if that happened today? today in 2024. People just breaking into an FBI office? That would be crazy. Its tactics included spreading misinformation, setting up false arrests, and even encouraging violence. The exposure of COINTELPRO led to widespread outrage, prompting the US government to establish stricter controls on intelligence operations, emphasizing its profound impact on civil liberties and the course of American political activism. Next up today we have the Sand Creek event. The Sand Creek event is a dark chapter in American history that took place on November 29, 1864. It involved a very brutal attack by Colorado U.S. volunteer cavalry on the peaceful village of Cheyenne and Arapaho people in southeastern Colorado Territory. Led by Colonel John Chivington, the troops descended on the unsuspecting villagers, taking the lives of around 150 indigenous people, most of whom were the most vulnerable in the community. This horrific event became a turning point, stirring widespread outrage and leading to increased scrutiny of US policies towards indigenous peoples. And finally on our list today we have the mass deportation. This is the name we'll be using for an operation that took place in 1954, but the official operation name employed an offensive term that we will not be repeating here today. This operation was a major immigration law enforcement initiative carried out in the United States, and it was launched in response to increasing concerns about unauthorized Mexican immigrants in the United States, particularly in agricultural areas. The operation, orchestrated by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS, aimed to apprehend and deport individuals who had entered the US illegally from Mexico. It involved a series of raids and checkpoints in cities and rural areas, especially in states close to the US-Mexico border like Texas and California. The initiative was marked by a significant show of force, including the involvement of federal agents and local law enforcement. While the government hailed the operation as a success, claiming that it led to the deportation of over 1 million migrants, the actual numbers of the operation's effectiveness have been debated by historians. Critics argue that it violated human rights and separated families, and moreover the operation's legacy is marred by reports of poor treatment and harsh conditions faced by those deported. Over time, the operation has come to be seen as a controversial chapter in American immigration history, highlighting the complexities and challenges of immigration policy and enforcement. There are a lot of things that we could have put on this list, but the choices were intended to give you some things that I personally have not spoken about before on this channel. Drop a comment down below to let us know what other dark moments in American history you think we should discuss next. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!